Hi, everyone. Welcome to the virtual Hammer Museum, coming to you live from Los Angeles. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the director of Hammer Public Programs, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's Hammer Forum. The Hammer Forum is a series of public discussions about current social and political issues, and is made possible with support from the Rosenbloom family. Now, we all know there's a major presidential election on November 3rd, but many people don't know there are some critical ballot measures we're also voting on here in California, and they will affect all of us who live here. I believe there are about 12 measures on the November 3rd ballot that we can vote on, and we're discussing 4 of them here in the Hammer Forum. And I want to encourage those of you watching tonight to share what you've learned with your friends and colleagues, because there's generally a lack of awareness right now that there's anything on the November 3rd ballot other than the presidential election. Before I get into what the ballot measures are, I want to give a quick public service announcement. Last March, I waited to vote until the day of the election, and I waited in line for 3 hours to vote. There was no COVID, and it was not a major presidential election. So just imagine what it could be like this year. So the PSA is, don't wait until November 3rd. It's recommended that you turn in your ballot 2 weeks in advance to avoid any counting problems. So October 19th is the date by which you should try to mail in or drop off your ballot, and make sure to follow all the instructions carefully so your ballot doesn't get tossed out for a simple error, like forgetting to sign your name on the envelope. So back to our mini-series on ballot measures. We did a Hammer Forum already on Prop 15, which is a bill that would raise property taxes on large corporations to current market rates, and which would raise money for California schools. Next Thursday, we're going to discuss 2 ballot measures. One would restore voting rights to people who have gotten out of prison and are now on parole, and one would end cash bail. So please join us next week for that. And tonight we're talking about Prop 16, which would repeal a ban on the use of affirmative action in California state institutions. Before we get started with the panel, I have a few notes for the audience. This program is conducted via a Zoom webinar, so we can't see or hear you in the audience. We can just see your names and anything you type into the chat or the Q&A boxes. We'd love for you all to introduce yourselves in the chat box and tell us where you're tuning in from. The chat's also an area where you and the audience can all talk with each other, and the Q&A box is where you type in questions you have for the panelists. Please note this program is being recorded and will be available later on the Hammer website. So now on to our wonderful panel. Our first guest speaker is Harvard Law School professor Randall Kennedy. He's one of the leading constitutional law scholars in the country and teaches courses on contracts, criminal law, and the regulation of race relations. Kennedy served as a law clerk for Judge J. Skelly Wright of the United States Court of Appeals and for Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. Professor Kennedy writes for a wide range of scholarly and general interest publications, and he's the author of 6 books, including Race, Crime, and the Law from 1998, For Discrimination, Race, Affirmative Action, and the Law in 2013, and The Persistence of the Color Line, Racial Politics and the Obama Presidency in 2011. Kennedy is a member of the American Law Institute, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Association, and he's a trustee emeritus of Princeton University. Our second panelist is UCLA research professor Patricia Gándara. She's the co-director of the Civil Rights Project at UCLA and the author of The Latino Education Crisis, The Consequences of Failed Social Policy, which was published by Harvard University Press. And she's an elected fellow of the National Academy of Education and the American Educational Research Association. And she served on President Obama's Commission on Educational Excellence for Hispanics. In 2016, Gándara co-authored a paper entitled 2 Decades After the Affirmative Action Ban, Evaluating the University of California's Race-Neutral Efforts, which is something we're certainly going to be discussing tonight. In fact, in the aftermath of the passage of California's Prop 209, which barred affirmative action in 1996, Professor Gándara was a member of a committee advising the president of the University of California, and she'll be filling us in on how that all went down. Our moderator tonight is Loyola Law School professor Jessica Levinson. Levinson studies the law of the political process, including election law and governance issues. Her work focuses on ethics, political corruption, voting rights, campaign finance, ballot initiatives, redistricting, term limits, and state budgets. She regularly appears as a legal and political expert in television and radio and in print. She's the host of the new podcast, Passing Judgment, and has a weekly legal segment on NPR member station KCRW here in Los Angeles. She's also an op-ed contributor for NBC.com and the associate director of Loyola's Journalist Law School. Professor Levinson served as the president of the Los Angeles Ethics Commission until 2018. She's also the founding director of Loyola Law School's Public Service Institute, which is dedicated to creating the next generation of leaders in government service. So hello and welcome, Randall Kennedy, Patricia Gándara, and Jessica Levinson.
Hello, Claudia. Thank you for having us. I'm going to wait till everybody comes up. I see Professor Kennedy, and I think we're going to see Professor Gándara in a minute. There we all are. We did it, everybody. Half the battle is already done. So I want to welcome everybody back to these Hammer Forums. It's nice to see so many familiar people, some of whom I actually know in real life, and some of whom we've gotten to know each other a little bit over the chats and the Q&As. As Claudia said, today we're going to focus on, I think, one of the most noteworthy ballot measures that we're facing in California on November 3rd. And our ballots will be arriving, I believe, starting on Monday. So we want to make sure that you are educated and ready for this one. Prop 16. I'm so thrilled, Patricia and Randall, that the two of you could do this. And the level of expertise you have is really invaluable. So Patricia, if we could start with you, what is Prop 16?
Well, Prop 16 is the proposition that will be on the ballot that rescinds Proposition 209, which was passed in 1996 and disallowed the use of race and ethnicity and gender in consideration of university admissions and in contracting. I think what I would add to that short description is that it also was named to be deliberately confusing. It was named the California Civil Rights Initiative, which led a lot of people, we think, to believe that they were actually voting for something other than what they voted for. And I would simply say also that it prohibits the use of race in targeting students for admission support. In other words, programs that could lead to admission and for scholarship funds. So that really hurt us a lot in the university in terms of trying to diversify the freshman incoming students.
Yeah, so these are always kind of confusing propositions where a yes means you end the ban, meaning a yes means you would allow for the use of affirmative action in certain situations. And we'll unpack all of that. Randall, what is affirmative action? And it's so unfair to ask you, but just in a few minutes, what is affirmative action?
Sure, thank you very much. And it's wonderful being here. I appreciate all the people who've helped to facilitate this meeting. Affirmative action is any policy that seeks to prefer in some way people who are associated with a given group. There are all sorts of affirmative action policies. There's affirmative action policies sometimes for people who have been in the military. Many states have affirmative action policies that prefer in-state candidates for admission to a school as opposed to out-of-state candidates. There's gender affirmative action. So affirmative action can come in many flavors. The one that has been the most controversial is racial affirmative action. So and this evening, I mean, it's sort of interesting because of course the proposition that we're talking about embraces gender, it embraces ethnicity, it embraces nationality, place of birth, but 90%, in fact, more than 95% of the discussion has to do with race. One other thing, affirmative action can come in a wide range of forms. You can have soft affirmative action. Let's suppose you have a tiebreaker rule. You have two candidates, and let's suppose that if there's a tie, you choose the woman, or if there's a tie, you choose the African American, or if there's a tie, you choose the Latino candidate. That would be a soft form of affirmative action. There are harder forms of affirmative action. For instance, let's suppose that you wanted to set aside some seats for people, and you had a quota system. That would be a very hard form. And of course, the harder the form, the more controversial the affirmative action policy. So it takes it can mean lots of different things. It can touch lots of different sorts of people, and it can be soft, or it can be hard, or it can be in places in between.
Yeah, and as you said, the measure on the ballot, Proposition 16, that would end the ban on affirmative action, it deals with race, sex, color, ethnicity, and national origin. Mm-hmm. And it deals with not just public education, but also public employment and public contracting. And we'll talk about all of that. Patricia, I just asked Randall kind of to unfairly, in just a few minutes, talk about what affirmative action is. It might feel obvious, but what are some of the goals of affirmative action?
Well, the primary goal of affirmative action is to redistribute opportunity, is the way I would put it. It's to level out the playing field a little bit, because particularly here in California, and that's of course is where we're talking about, we have the most unequal education system in the country, highly segregated, with African American, Latino, and Native American students concentrated in the lowest performing schools with all kinds of problems, and white students and Asian students concentrated in the highest performing schools that prepare them well for admission to the university. So those of us who favor some use of affirmative action have believed that it's very important to do something to intervene in this gross inequity that we have and level out that playing field to some extent, so that equally talented students, but who have not had all the advantages perhaps of other students, can still be in the running for university admissions.
Can I jump in here for a minute?
Yeah, please.
I completely agree with what Patricia just said. I think that the justification that you just gave is, first of all, that was the justification when affirmative action was really emerging as a type of social policy. And I think it's the one that many people think about. But, and here we get immediately into complication. That justification is not the justification that the Supreme Court of the United States embraces. And so we are currently in a situation where, I mean, if I were the lawyer for a jurisdiction, a school, a school system, or for a county or a state, under current law, the Supreme Court of the United States doesn't actually allow for affirmative action for the reason that you gave, even though, in fact, that is the reason. Unfortunately, we're in a situation in which the justices have said that the one reason, that the one justification that they seem to allow is the justification under the flag of diversity, the idea that we will have better schools, we will have better pedagogy, we will have better class discussions if you have students from a wide range of different backgrounds, different places, different areas, different interests, and there'll be more diversity. And if there's more diversity, we'll have better learning. Now, I think there's something to that argument, but frankly, I think that the argument that you set forth is actually the more compelling one. And one of the problems is, because of the state of the law, we really are talking about affirmative action often in a way that we don't really talk about the things that are most compelling.
Yeah, well, I'll just add to that in fact, that's the reason why I preface my comments with here in California, because we have been frozen here in California with the definition that we began with. And while, of course, at the Civil Rights Project, we track very closely on the Supreme Court decisions and how these can affect individuals across the country, here in California, we have not had the opportunity to make the diversity argument because we have been without affirmative action now for over 2 decades.
And one of the things I want to talk about in a moment, once I'm sure that we've gotten all of the kind of basics of defining the ballot measure that would end affirmative action, once I'm sure that we're done kind of laying the table, setting the table, so to speak, I do want to talk about what the current Supreme Court has said and what it's likely to say when it comes to affirmative action. And I just saw that we got a question about whether or not the proposition is likely to pass constitutional muster. So I'm going to ask, because in the past, loyal Hammer viewers, I have gone down a little bit of rabbit hole early. I'm going to ask that we hold those questions for a minute. And Patricia, I want to go back to a little bit more of the basics of what we're thinking about on the ballot. So we have Proposition 16. Again, it would end the ban on affirmative action, meaning it would repeal Proposition 209. Everybody, I promise I'm not going to keep using these numbers. It was passed in 1996. Can you give us a little bit of the history of how did we come to get Prop 209 on the ballot, and what were the arguments for and against?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Jessica, and I think important to mention, because at that time, we're talking about the mid-1990s, California was going through a dramatic demographic change. And it was, in many ways, it was like what we're seeing today, in particular red states across the nation, where there's a certain uneasiness about the changes that are taking place. So California was rapidly becoming a state with a very large percentage of immigrants, of individuals of color, and the Republican Party, which was largely white, was shrinking. And what happened was that we had a cluster of propositions. We had all basically within 2 years of each other on the ballot. 187, which was hugely anti-immigrant, attempted to take away all kinds of public services from immigrants. One, which was 227, which banned bilingual instruction in the state, and which, by the way, has been recently overturned. And this particular one. So what happened as a result of this was that the Republican Party actually never rebounded. These were passed. 187 was found unconstitutional in almost all of its aspects. 227, as I mentioned, was recently rescinded. And then we still have the ban on affirmative action. But the state has changed over time. And this is no longer the state that it was in the mid-1990s, when there was this great nervousness among the population about the changes that were taking place.
And I know you already said it, Patricia, but could you remind the audience what 187 and 227 did?
187, what it did was it basically attempted to block any kind of public services, access to health services, even schooling, which we have. I mean, this is well acknowledged as being constitutional in Plyler v. Doe, taking away any kind of services from immigrants. And so it was just a very anti-immigrant proposition. And the other one alongside of that was Prop 227, which banned bilingual instruction in the state.
All right, so we've talked about what the ballot measure would do. Again, it would end the ban on affirmative action. What did the ban say? Government and public institutions cannot discriminate or grant preferential treatment. That's the key, or grant preferential treatment to persons on the basis of, as Randall said, we focus on race, but it's more than race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin. And we focus on public education, but it's not just public education, it's also public employment and public contracting. Think of, and we'll talk about this, but think of how powerful a lot of public employers are in terms of the contracts that they can give, whether or not they can prefer minority-owned businesses, the employment outside of public education, the people that they can hire. So huge implications. You know, we tend to focus on race and higher education, but I just want to make sure that the viewers know implications outside of those areas as well. And Randall, last clarification, because I've heard some kind of misleading ads about this, and I know that you're not in California, but would this ballot measure mandate affirmative action?
No, it would not. And I'll say two things. Well, let's stick with this one first. No, it would not. It wouldn't mandate anything, actually. What it would do would be to remove limitations on the discretion of local educational authorities or local authorities in other domains. It has prevented them from engaging in policies that they might think would be useful to the state and useful to the country. Does it require them to mandate affirmative action? No, it doesn't require them. It would simply, the way things are now, if the educational officials think that affirmative action would be good for education, they're not allowed to do it. Even if they think it would be good, they're not allowed to do it. If, on the other hand, what exists now were to be rescinded, educational officials could, at their sound discretion, use race-based affirmative action to either effectuate reparative justice, which is what Patricia was emphasizing, you know, helping people who have been historically disadvantaged, or if you think it would be good for the purposes of diversity, you know, making for better education. There's a third one, however, there's another justification which we did not mention earlier, and I think that one might put that under the rubric of distributive justice. Out in California, you got lots of different groups. And one might have the idea, well, if we have public institutions that are very important, don't we want to have some notion of representation? Let's imagine that there's some group that for various reasons that no representation. And one might say, well, you know, we want various groups to be part of our institutions, if for no other reason, frankly, than to sort of signal that we're all in it, that everybody is part of the polity. And we want to signal that, we want to show that. So that's a third justification that some people have voiced. But again, to emphasize your point, no, if Proposition 16 were to come into effect, it would not mandate anything with respect to, requiring affirmative action. Simply allow it if officials wanted to impose it.
So I think this is a really good point that Professor Kennedy has made, and it's analogous, I think, to the court has acknowledged the issue of critical mass. And we have, in fact, that problem in California. We have a small African-American population, less than 7% of all of our students. And what has happened in the absence of affirmative action is that we've had the terrible situation of ending up with so few African-Americans in particular. We could also say the same thing for Native Americans, but African-Americans are a larger percentage. We have the terrible situation where there are just a handful in the schools. And in the university, in their classes. And this is, a lot of people have done research on this. I mean, this is very disconcerting to students to feel so alone and to feel so much as though they don't really have a community. So we have felt that it's important, one aspect of affirmative action, to deal with the critical mass issue as well.
So let's stay with this issue for a minute of, now that we've kind of defined the proposition, let's stay with this issue of goals of affirmative action that I hear both of you talking about, leveling the playing field, reparative justice, diversity, distributive justice, critical mass. Randall, let's go back to you for a moment, and then I'll ask Patricia the same question. Are there other ways of trying to, maybe we should take it goal by goal, but in general, are there other ways of trying to achieve those goals without race and sex-based affirmative action?
Sure. There are other ways that one might try to achieve all those goals. One might say, for instance, let's not talk about race. Let's just talk about socioeconomic background. So let's have affirmative action for poorer people. And there are people who really get behind that and say that that's the way we should go. And part of the argument for that, some people say, is, well, if we have affirmative action for disadvantaged people using a socioeconomic metric, that will have the collateral effect of disproportionately helping racial minorities, to the extent that racial minorities, Latinos, Blacks, to the extent that other racial minorities as well, to the extent that racial minorities tend to be, socioeconomically disadvantaged. If socioeconomic disadvantage is the metric that one uses, then by extension, racial minorities will be benefited. So there's some people who say that. And in fact, that has been one of the ways in which California authorities, especially educational authorities, have responded to the earlier proposition. So to the extent that you couldn't use race or ethnicity directly, there were some who tried to use socioeconomic indicators as a sort of a go-around method. So in any event, that's one way one could handle it.
So I hear you kind of saying that that's a workaround because lack of socioeconomic opportunities can in some ways maybe replace or be a proxy for, or be a kind of backdoor way to try and achieve the same issue. Yes. And in your voice, maybe I'm wrong, but I kind of heard that you thought that wasn't quite an elegant fix. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, it doesn't do all that one might want. If you think that racial minorities have been disadvantaged in American life, if you think that, and I do, many people do, as soon as you start using proxies, inefficiencies start coming in. The fact of the matter is that race is not the same as socioeconomic disadvantage. They often overlap. It's true, there's some overlap, but they're not the same. It's also true that with respect to race and ethnicity, there are things that are the hidden injuries of race. So when people talk about socioeconomic disadvantage, sometimes they speak as if a white person, let's imagine a white family making, let's say, $50,000 a year. And you'll hear people talk as if a white family making $50,000 a year is in the same boat as a Black family making $50,000 a year. No, they're not. What about the history of those two families? What about the wealth accumulated by those two families? What about where those two families might live in a community. They're not the same. And one of the arguments for taking race into account is that, well, if you're interested in trying to make up for past racial, past ethnic injustice, the most efficient way is the most straightforward way. And if race is the way, if you're interested in the racial issue, then let's talk about the racial issue. Let's not, sort of be evasive and go around the mulberry bush.
Sometimes solutions are most elegant when you actually solve the problem by directly using the remedy that you're trying to achieve. Patricia, can I ask you to answer the same question, which is really, are there other ways, maybe economic-based affirmative action is the main way, but there are other ways that you've studied to try and achieve some of the same goals, but not use race and or sex?
Well, of course, this is the question that we asked ourselves upon the passage of 209. And we put our heads together in the university and we actually ran the numbers. Because of course, the very first thing that comes up is we'll just use socioeconomic status, since these groups that you're concerned about tend to be disadvantaged. Running the numbers, we saw that using SES was not going to solve our problem. In fact, we have a great deal of diversity in the state. We have a lot of immigrants. We have a lot of immigrants with good educational backgrounds, but look like they're poor. Because as people are introduced from outside into this economy, they oftentimes are not able to get credentialed, and people look poor. But it's just another way, I think, that Professor Kennedy was indicating that it's not the same. Race and poverty are not the same. And we realized that using that as a proxy was not going to get us the diversity that we needed. So I mentioned before that we are a very unequal state and that we can identify the schools where there are a lot of African American and Latino students who are disadvantaged. And so we took the strategy of going to the schools. This was a primary strategy, was to go to those schools and work with the schools. An initial strategy was to work with 50 of these schools, which represented less than 5% of the students in the state. We're also a big state. So the cost of that endeavor of working with 50 schools to try and get students ready for the university who were already disadvantaged in many ways did not produce a whole lot of students who would therefore be admissible to the University of California. But we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars in preparation of students. But since we cannot target the students that we most want to be able to introduce into the university, we have to cast a wide net. And by casting that wide net, 90% of the students that we touch are not going to apply to the University of California. So it's costly. It's a good thing to do. I mean, I think nobody faults that, says that it's not a good thing to do for students, but it was not an avenue to really diversifying the university.
Sorry, Randall, were you about to say something, or should we move on to the, I see so many good questions, and I have to tell you there's 12 questions and 2 of them are about where you got your glasses. So we're gonna have to get to those in a moment. Is there, Randall, I'll move to you now. Is there an argument that affirmative action does not work as intended? And specifically in this question, now or later, could you address what we mean by reverse racism? This is something I read about, and probably people who come to a Hammer Forum who are already educated, already want to learn about it, this proposition, have heard that phrase before.
Sure. So there are many arguments against affirmative action. And certainly in the courts, the attack on affirmative action usually takes the form of a person who has not gotten, we're talking about the educational affirmative action. We have a person, typically a white person, who has not gotten into a school, and they're complaining, and they say, but for affirmative action, I would have gotten into the school. Therefore, I am a victim of racial discrimination. If I was not white, if I was a person of color, I would have gotten in, but I'm white, therefore I did not get in. Now I'm being discriminated against. So the argument is that person is a victim of what they say, reverse discrimination. Now, what do I think about that? I'd say two things. Number one, do I think that there could be reverse discrimination? Yeah, I think there could be reverse discrimination. I think this is a big country, lots of different institutions, lots of different settings. Are there settings in which a white person could be discriminated against? Sure, I think that. Are there settings in which I think that people of Asian ancestry could be discriminated against? Absolutely. The state of California, a long history of discrimination against people of Asian ancestry. I think that discrimination can take a wide array of forms, and any group could potentially be the victim of discrimination. So I think that it could happen. Let me say one other thing, however, about reverse discrimination. From every effort that has been made to elevate a racial minority has been met with the claim that it was reverse discrimination. So, the first federal civil rights law in the United States was the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It was the act that said that all persons in the United States should be able to own property, should be able to testify, should be able to enter into contracts, that sort of thing, fundamental civil rights on the same basis as white people. That first civil rights law was vetoed by the President of the United States, Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson said that that law gave, quote, discriminating protection, end quote, to the Negro. That has been the case over and over and over again. If you take a look at the debates over the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Black people were simply trying to, get a foothold into employment markets. That was called reverse discrimination. So I think that in these discussions, I've said, one has to be careful. I don't want anybody to be the victim of invidious racial discrimination. If an institution or a person is trying to put somebody down, that I call invidious discrimination. Affirmative action, in my view, has not been that. Affirmative action has been about trying to reach the goals that Patricia talked about earlier. Either reach the goal of redistribution, trying to help out people who've been put down in the past, the goal of representation. We want schools that to some degree signal that everybody is an equal and respected part of the polity, or the goal of diversity. We think that we'll have better education in our schools if we have a wide array of people in them. Affirmative action has been aimed at reaching those sorts of goals. Now, are there criticisms? Sure, there are criticisms. There's some people who say that, especially now, some people say that affirmative action is a pretext for invidious discrimination against certain groups. My home institution, Harvard University, right now is being sued by people who are representing Asian American students and say that Asian American students are the victims of invidious discrimination. And it's being hidden by affirmative action. So there are people who claim that affirmative action is bad because it stigmatizes the beneficiaries. Let's suppose that I get into one of your fine schools in California, and then I show up and somebody says, Kennedy, the only reason you're here is because you were a beneficiary of affirmative action. We don't think you're as good. We don't think you belong. Well, that's a cost. Another cost, and then I'll stop, but another cost that certainly your audience is going to hear about is so-called mismatch theory. I'd especially like to hear Patricia talk about this because I'm sure that she has experience dealing with this claim. One claim is that affirmative action is bad because it over promotes people. A person who the claim is that affirmative action will put into a leading school people who are promising, but they're not really quite up to a leading school. It would be better if they were in a lower tier school. And then when you put them up in an upper tier school, they're mismatched. They don't do as well as they had hoped. They might get discouraged, that sort of argument.
The stigma issue, we famously read Justice Clarence Thomas talk about it often, that this stigmatizes African Americans in particular, that you walk into a room and people think, oh, we know why you're here. And I'm sorry, Patricia, I didn't mean to interrupt. I did want you to pick up on all of that. And because apparently Randall has infiltrated my Google Doc, the next question, in fact, was, can you please explain the mismatch theory?
Yes, and he also has keyed up actually several things that I was wanting to comment on. Yes, the mismatch theory, and he's explained it really very well, I think, the notion that if you're not really at the same level as the other individuals, that you don't benefit from being in these institutions, an elite institution, and that you would do better in a less elite institution. Actually, there's a ton of research on this now. We could give you half a dozen studies right now that all conclude the same thing. And I think this is a terribly important point. For the individual who qualifies, and this is another point that I've wanted to, I'm sorry, there's like half a dozen points here I'm wanting to make. I think oftentimes affirmative action is cast as something that allows unqualified people to get in. It has never been that. It has never been that in California. It has never been that in any place where it is reasonably practiced. It's about qualified individuals, those who meet the criteria for acceptance, to gain an opportunity to enroll, because there are always more people who want to get in than there are spaces allowed. And so the notion here is that you admit some qualified individuals who might not otherwise have gotten in for 1 point or 2 points or on a handful of points on an SAT or an ACT, which, by the way, the research also shows makes no difference in terms of outcomes when you're talking about such a small difference. But what the research tells us about mismatch is that the more selective the institution the student attends, the better the outcomes will be, and the greater the likelihood of graduation and actually succeeding. And so, and I have to point out that that's controlling for background, for test scores, controlling, so you effectively have the same kind of individual. And we have those figures for here in California. If you're the same student and you attend the University of California, you have about an 85% chance of actually getting a bachelor's degree in 6 years. If you're the same student, controlling for the same kind of student with the same background, and you go to the state university, which is less selective. This is not to put down the state university, but it is simply less selective. You have about a 50% chance of getting a degree within 6 years. That's a huge gap. That means you're investing in a lot of individuals who are not actually going to get that degree because you bought into this mismatch theory. And then of course, there's the community colleges, which I think can be a wonderful avenue for people who are well prepared to go on. But unfortunately, most students of color, most low-income students don't go on and don't ever get a degree. So it's terribly important where you attend, and the differences are not fungible. I wanted to mention a couple things too, that we tend to focus a lot on freshman admissions, but the loss of affirmative action in California has had a dramatically negative impact on professional schools and graduate education. Graduate education produces our professoriate. And so if you choke off that pipeline, you have fewer and fewer individuals who are qualified, diverse individuals who are qualified for the professoriate. And we have never really recovered from the undergraduate admissions, but we have never recovered from professional schools either. And so in California today, we are really hard pressed, for example, Latino physicians. Over 40% of the population is Latino, and yet we're something like 53,000 Latino physicians short because we're not producing them. And this is, we've seen, very much related to the loss of affirmative action, of the ability to say, okay, you're a couple points less on this or that, but we need physicians in this area. And the other point I want to make is we've talked a lot about individual opportunity. So the opportunity for an individual to gain access to the university, as well as contracting. We really haven't gotten into the contracting in that. But I think it's really important to stand back and look at what's the impact on the state. The state is now majority minority. The state is about 60% among the graduating high school students, Latino, African American, Native American. And yet they are represented in the university at less than half that. And we've done research at the Civil Rights Project looking at the shifting demographics in the state and what that is doing to the average education level. This matters a lot. If we can have affirmative action, if it can help us a little bit, and it won't solve all the problems. It didn't when we had affirmative action, and it wouldn't if we brought it back, but it would help. It would give us another indicator. But this state must do a better job of educating its students of color, because the various analysts have looked at down the future 10 and 20 years, and we are short the numbers of people that we need to simply fill the existing jobs that require a college degree. And we're not getting there at this rate. It's going to have an enormous impact on the state. It's going to have an enormous impact on certain sectors of the state as well.
Could I underline two things that Patricia just mentioned? In agreement, I just want to underline them. One, she said, affirmative action as reasonably practiced. Now, it seems to me that what's being said there is, we recognize that any social policy can be applied in a way that is stupid. So, could you have an application of affirmative action that is stupid? Sure, you could. Just like you can have taxation policy that's stupid. Just like you can have, policies with regard to how fast you can go down the highway that's stupid. It's not, you can have a stupid social policy. And I'm sure that there probably, it's a big country, I'm sure that there probably have been affirmative action policies that have not been well designed. And it seems to me that for proponents of affirmative action, that is a concession that it's okay to make sure that, we have to let's make sure that if you're going to have affirmative action policies, that they're well designed. There is no reason, however, that a well-designed affirmative action policy runs afoul of the various objections that people have made. There's another thing with your last comment about, you have a state. Let's take a look at the demographics of our state. We have to think about a wide array of things. That is the argument that Sandra Day O'Connor made in one of the last big affirmative action cases, the Grutter case involving the University of Michigan. And the thing that she was attentive to actually was, and she expressly mentioned, she says, let's take a look at the military academies. She was very moved by the heads of the various arms of the military, who wrote briefs in and said, listen, our military is a very diverse military. And if we are talking about teamwork, if we are trying to develop an overall, arm of government that needs to do the sorts of things that the military needs to do, we need to have legitimacy in the eyes not only of people in the military, but we also need to have legitimacy in the eyes of the society. And to do that, we're going to have to bring in everybody. We cannot afford rigid mandates that prevent us from acting in a supple way to deal with the various difficulties that our society faces. So in any event, those were two things that you said. I just wanted to just put an exclamation mark next to them.
So, I'm sorry, Patricia.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to thank Randall for saying that, because I think we can get very caught up in individual opportunity, but really this is about the welfare of the state, for my mind. I care about individuals being treated fairly, but I care deeply about what happens to the state as a whole. And if we continue on this path with undereducating the majority of our population, we can't sustain things in this state. And affirmative action gives us that opportunity to make some difference. Also, if we're going to be going to Q&A soon, there was another point I wanted to make, and that is that perhaps we could say that there is a silver lining in some way to Prop 209, in that it forced us to look at some different ways of thinking about admissions in the university. And it forced us into holistic review, which I think is a very good idea. And that is, the University of California today, a couple of months ago, it had 14 characteristics it looked at. Today, it looks at 13 characteristics. But looks at various characteristics of the students beyond just a grade point average and an SAT score. It looks at the kind of background that they came from, the sorts of challenges they've had, the kind of, quote, grit that they may have demonstrated, their involvement in their communities. Bringing back affirmative action would simply give us one more characteristic to consider among many characteristics in an individual. So I think sometimes, in fact, I would have loved to have had a conversation about the whole notion of preferences, because I would argue that you can do affirmative action without effectively doing preferences. But certainly in holistic review is a way that you can include more information about a person's race, ethnicity, gender, but consider it as part of a whole individual and what that means for what their life experience has been like.
So much to pick up on. I've been womaning the Q&A throughout and trying to weave in some great questions. Randall, I don't want to leave the main part of the conversation before we talk about the legal standards, because we've kind of circled around it a couple of times. You mentioned the Grutter case, you mentioned Justice O'Connor's opinions. If proposition, and we got a couple of questions on this. So if a yes on Proposition 16 means that we're ending the ban on affirmative action, which means that states and local governments can create affirmative action programs.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have to create affirmative action programs, but they can do so.
Mm-hmm.
This would overturn Proposition 209 from 1996, which prohibited the use of these affirmative action programs.
Mm-hmm.
So if we assume that Californians say, yes, affirmative action is an option again,
Mm-hmm.
what's the current legal standard that local government, states, and even the federal government can use when it comes to affirmative action?
Well, if you take race into account in any public policy, you have to meet what the Supreme Court refers to as strict, you have to meet the strict scrutiny standard. In other words, you've got to show a super duper duper good reason for taking race into account. Now, can you take race into account? Yes, but you've got to persuade the justices or whoever, you know, if it goes to the Supreme Court or whatever court we're in, you've got to persuade them that there is a compelling justification. It's not just reasonable, it has to be a compelling justification for taking race into account. Now, if the next question is, well, what are courts likely to do? It's very unclear what the courts are likely to do. It's been several years since the Supreme Court has dealt with one of these cases. Well, in those several years, there's been change on the Supreme Court. There are a number of new justices. Right now, as we speak, there is a candidate who will, you know, maybe fill another seat. So we really don't know what the courts are going to do. My own view on this is, obviously, I'm a lawyer. Obviously, I pay attention to the courts. Obviously, I think that people ought to pay attention to the courts. But I would caution people. I would caution people on that. I would caution people not to think of the courts as the only source in our society for thinking about the Constitution. All of us live under the Constitution of the United States. All of us should be active in thinking about what that means. And I think that everybody should try to reach a decision for themselves on what they think would be proper in our society. The Supreme Court of the United States is not always correct. In fact, with respect to, certainly if we're talking about with respect to race, it has been notoriously wrong on a number of occasions. So I say, you know, pay attention to the judges. They might have the power to ultimately decide the case, but I think that the citizenry should think for themselves about, you know, what do they think? What do we think? What do we think would make for a good society?
Can I just add something to that, Randall? The other, not without wanting to get into the territory of the lawyer here, but the other aspect is that one has to demonstrate, in order to use affirmative action, one has to demonstrate that there was not another viable way. In other words, it's narrowly tailored as a remedy, that there was not another viable way to do this other than use race. And I mentioned this because I think we have demonstrated with the scholarship that we have done that there isn't. We've spent more than 20 years in the University of California spending hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars and all kinds of programs and schemes to try and get back to where we were at one time before the ban on affirmative action. And we have never been successfully able to do that. So I think that that part of the legal challenge can be met.
I want to jump in one more time. With respect to the court, and especially the Supreme Court of the United States, the fact of the matter is, in the affirmative action area, it's always been very narrow margins. One vote, maybe two, but very typically narrow margins. What does that suggest to us? That suggests to us that, you know, different people see this different ways. You can have well-trained attorneys who read the 14th Amendment and come to different conclusions on whether race-based affirmative action satisfies the dictates of the 14th Amendment. And that's part of the reason why I urge, you know, everybody listening, whether you've been to law school or not, to talk about this, think about this, consider for yourself. What do you think would be a good way of handling a multiracial society like ours that is still grappling with deep, deep, deep divisions? What is a way of trying to bring together a society in which it is very evident? You just walk out on the street, you can see the scars of racial oppression. My mother, we don't have to go way back. I mean, you know, when people sometimes act as if we're talking about things that happen in the Middle Ages. No, we're not. We're not talking about things that happen in the Middle Ages. My mother of blessed memory, I'm from South Carolina. My mother of blessed memory had to leave the state of South Carolina to get her graduate education in education. There was no school in South Carolina where a Black person could get a master's in education. What the officials in South Carolina said was, here, we'll give you some money so that you can go to school out of state. There's no place here in this state that will accept a Black person for, you know, graduate education. That happened in lots of different places. Again, we're not talking about long, long ago. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, millions in the United States, who themselves suffered suffered all sorts of racial restrictions that limited them in various ways. And because they were limited, it limited what they could pass on to their children. We are still trying to grapple with that. And what I would say is, so in as much as we're trying to grapple with that, let's leave open various possibilities for grappling with it. No, we ought not allow government to invidiously try to put down anybody in any group, whites included. If white people are being put down because they're white, I'm against that. But with respect to trying to bind the wounds of the racial oppression in our society, why not try to do that? Why not try to, if educators think that we'll have better education if we make sure that there are lots of kids from different places in our classrooms, why not let them try that? If we think that legitimacy, and if we're talking about public institutions, that's very important, especially if legitimacy is a concern, why not allow officials to use the entire array of policies to try to, you know, reach these various goals that officials want to reach? At least that's my position.
I'm glad that you brought that up because I've attempted to frame this sort of in the terms of the economic welfare of the state, but it's really about the social fabric of this state. And we are tearing that fabric apart when we have such inequitable opportunities for individuals, starting with their very first day at school. And I think the point is very well taken, that this is not something that's in the past. This is right now, every day with us.
Patricia, could we pick up on that for a minute? 1996, at least for me, doesn't feel all that long ago. And can you explain how the ban on affirmative action changed California? You how did it change? I think, obviously your work is focused on higher education, but what were some of the immediate effects that we saw and some of the longer term effects? I know we've touched on it a little bit, but I've seen some.
Touched on the university. Minority contracting went way down as well. And those are opportunities for people to join the middle class and to be sustained in the middle class. Those are important opportunities when you're talking about people who are equally qualified. But we know that from other bodies of research that we tend to select the individuals whom we hire or whom we work with who look like us. And unfortunately, if you don't look like the people who are in power at the time, your chances of being selected, no matter how qualified you are, go down. And so that's a way that affirmative action helps to stabilize an economy and a middle class as well. And we've lost ground on that. Politically, it has changed the state dramatically. It is very hard for a Republican to be elected in this state today because of the continuing belief by the electorate in this state that party has been associated with very anti-immigrant, anti-people of color policies.
In the political science realm, this is obviously a topic of hot discussion and debate. And of course, the Republican Party at this point is third. There's Democrats, there's no party preference voters, and then there's Republicans for, I think, a variety of reasons. Gosh, there are so many things that I want to just keep talking about, but let's end with this, and then we'll get to Q&A. To both of you, it feels like maybe a simple question, but I want to bring it back to why people tuned in today. They tuned in because they want to learn about the propositions. They want to make informed decisions. There's at least a dozen on the ballot. Proposition 16, of course, says we're ending the ban on affirmative action, which again means we're allowing affirmative action. We're not mandating it, we're allowing it. Mm-hmm. Patricia, let's stay with you for a moment, if that's okay. What do you think will happen if we pass Proposition 16? How will government contracts and university contracts be affected? I know I'm asking you to repeat a little bit, but I want to sum up a lot of the difficult things we've been talking about.
Well, in terms of contracting, I would hope that it would go back to somewhere where we were before and actually increase. Since 1996, our population has also changed quite dramatically. So we would hope to see more opportunities for those individuals who've not had them. In terms of the university, it's not going to radically change what's happening in the university in terms of admissions. The University of California has become increasingly difficult to enter. I think we had 120,000 applicants last year at UCLA for about 7,000 seats. But it's going to give a better shot to those individuals who do qualify, and it will make a difference on the margin in terms of numbers. But I think most importantly, it makes a difference in terms of a statement of a commitment to diversity and commitment to a greater equality for all groups in the state. And that is really important, that people feel like they belong, they feel like they're honored, and they feel like they have a chance in this state, regardless of where they come from.
Randall, same question to you. How do you think things, it's kind of a way to sum up everything we've been talking about. If we end the ban, if we allow affirmative action, what are some of, on the 30,000 foot view level, what are some of the things that you can change and you think will change with respect to education, contracting, hiring?
I think it'll make some difference. And, I'll just put my cards on the table. I hope that the proposition passes. And in many of my comments, I've indicated why. I mean, I think anybody listening to me would be clear where I'm coming from on this. Having said that, I want to emphasize that I think it would be a mistake to, let's not exaggerate the significance, frankly, of affirmative action. you know, and here, I suppose, one thing that I find really quite bothersome about the debate over affirmative action is sometimes you would get the sense from people that the world turns on this. This is actually a rather small, a rather marginal social policy that we're talking about. And the fact of the matter is, affirmative action is only an issue at selective institutions. Most institutions of higher education in the United States, affirmative action doesn't even come up because they're not selective. Affirmative action only comes up when you have more people who want into the institution than you have seats at the institution. So affirmative action, to a large degree, you're immediately talking about people who are in a are doing okay. I mean, if you are a plausible candidate for the University of California at Berkeley, you're going to be doing okay. I mean, if you're a plausible candidate to get into UCLA, you're going to do okay. Because frankly, if you don't get into UCLA, if you're a plausible candidate for UCLA, you'll get into someplace else that's, very good. Same thing goes for Berkeley. I think that when we talk about affirmative action, and again, I am a pro-affirmative action person, but what I'm saying is, let's recognize that affirmative action is going to be helping people who are doing okay. Let's not forget that there are a whole bunch of people lower down who actually affirmative action is not immediately going to help. I mean, the person who doesn't make it out of high school is not going to be helped by affirmative action because they're not a plausible candidate for any of the institutions that we've been talking about. And yet there are a lot of kids who don't make it out of high school. There are a lot of kids who make it out of high school, but who are still, they haven't learned very much. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think that the struggle over affirmative action is important, but let's have perspective as well. It's not the only thing about which people should be concerned with, if we're talking about racial justice, if we're talking about ethnic justice, if we're talking about what is going to be needed to knit our country back together again. It's significant, but it should not by any means monopolize our energy, monopolize our attention.
Yeah, so Jessica, obviously I agree that, that this is not going to make a radical change overnight in who gets accepted. But there's an important point I would like to make, that how we shot ourselves in the foot with the ban on affirmative action. People who went around worrying that we were admitting too many underqualified individuals. What we found, in fact, particularly with the African-American students, we lost, because of the loss of affirmative action and our inability to target funds, to target scholarship funds to the African-American community, for example, we actually lost the top tier of African-American students to other selective universities around the country who were only too happy to have those students and who could provide for them. So ironically, we simply shot ourselves in the foot. And these individuals, once leaving the state, maybe some would come back, but we lost a significant sector of individuals that could have made huge contributions to this state by banning affirmative action.
So, I'm so loath to stop there. We're going to pick up with a few of the Q&As. I've been looking at them and trying to kind of put them into buckets and answer them real time as well. One thing I want the audience to know before we leave, a little bit on the campaign finance, the yes side, meaning allow for affirmative action programs, has raised about $12 million in contributions as to the last reporting cycle. The no side, meaning keep the ban on affirmative action, has raised less than $1 million in contributions. But lesson for ballot measure watchers, that doesn't always translate into the poll. So the PPIC poll, the Public Policy Institute of California poll, that polled, I think, the second week of September, found that there were 31% in favor, meaning allowing affirmative action programs, 47% against, 22% undecided. The Berkeley IG poll, very similar, 33% in favor. Again, that means allowing affirmative action programs. A yes on Prop 16 would allow affirmative action programs. 41% opposed, 26 undecided. It's not where the yes side wants to be at this point. The no side has to be feeling, I think, comparatively comfortable. 22 to 26% is a lot undecided, but we know that it takes a lot more money to move people from their default, which is a no, to move them to a yes. Now, even though the yes side has far outraised, again, by a ratio of about 12 to 1, it's not clear that that much money is going to be able to move people to the yes side. So that's not saying anything about the benefits or detriments of the measure. That's just to say that's where we are right now in terms of public opinion. Now, a lot of people start tuning into ballot measures, particularly when there's a presidential election that's kind of sucking up all the oxygen in the room later. So we certainly want to look for that polling that comes out in about, I think, two to 2.5 weeks now. With that, a couple of questions. Randall, we can start with you on quotas. Mm-hmm. So are quotas legal? And if we allow affirmative action programs to continue, would we be instituting quotas?
No, quotas are definitely, the courts for a long time have been very down on quotas. So what typically happens is if you are anti-affirmative action, you quota. You invoke the specter of the quota. If you are pro-affirmative action, you say, no, I'm not for quotas. I'm for, so nowadays, I'm for individualized attention, et cetera. Now, I'm here speaking, I'm not representing anybody. I'm representing my own thoughts. I'm sharing my thoughts with my, colleagues in California. My own view of that is that when the word quota comes up, for me, I'm not bothered, frankly, by the term quota. If I was representing someone, if I was representing an institution, I would not use it because it is so strongly stigmatized. It is so strongly attacked in the legal system. So paying attention to that, I would never use the term. But, I'm not in court right now. I'm just talking with, my colleagues. And in talking with colleagues, what I say is, listen, there's nothing, as far as I'm concerned, necessarily troubling about the idea of a quota. We have quotas in various aspects of our society. Since the administration of Lyndon Johnson, there has existed an implicit quota in the presidential cabinet. Every president since Lyndon Johnson has had at least one Black person in the cabinet, at least one. No president would say there's a quota of at least one. Of course they wouldn't say that, but is in fact that the case? Yeah, I think that's in fact the case. Is that a bad thing? I don't think it's actually a bad thing. I think there's a reason for that. Again, you can push anything too far. If you were to say, well, we have to have 10 come hell or high water. Well, no, I wouldn't be in favor of that. I mean, if you were, for instance, to put somebody who was an illiterate in a college class and then they were to flunk out, well, that would be a very wasteful thing to do. That wouldn't be doing a favor for anyone. On the other hand, just suppose you said, listen, our goal is to have at the very least 10, and you could put in your, 10, you could put in whatever group you're talking about. Is that necessarily a bad thing? In my view, no, it's not necessarily a bad thing. You have a mission, you're trying to accomplish your mission. Maybe if you put some hard numbers on it, it will enable you to see where you are. It will enable you better to effectuate your mission. So I'm not bothered, frankly, by the term quota, but in American law, it is a bothersome notion which people stay away from.
Patricia, there's been a couple of questions about the college admissions scandal dubbed Operation Varsity Blues, which of course gained some headlines because there were very well-known people, or a few particularly well-known people, at least in LA, who essentially paid people to take their kids' SAT exams or just blatantly lied on college applications. And the questions are kind of surrounding the same issue, which is, would Prop 16, and forgive me for not phrasing this better, but would Prop 16 have any effect on that? Would allowing for affirmative action in higher education, I think, prevent that situation? Would it exacerbate that situation? Would it have any effect on the college admission scandals? Or maybe more broadly, would it have any effect on the more nuanced versions of Operation Varsity Blues, which is the, oh, I hope my child can be here because we'd so love to support your science program. Or I hope my child can go to school here because everyone in my family has sent my child to school at this fine institution. So I hope there's something to answer in that very lengthy question.
Well, we don't have legacies in the University of California, so that's not an issue. I thought that was really terribly unfortunate that this became such a huge issue, because we were talking about a handful of people over hundreds of thousands of applications. And we pretty much identified where that was happening is in the sport area of sports, and that has already been changed as a result. So I think we did learn from these incidents that you have to be much more watchful in things like rowing teams. But would affirmative action affect that? That's an interesting question. I can't imagine quite how it would, because affirmative action is more focused on allowing underrepresented groups, which none of these individuals was. They were overrepresented groups, individuals. The focus is on underrepresented groups who actually qualify for the university at similar levels of other individuals. So it'd be hard for me to imagine how it could work in that way.
There have been a couple of questions in the chat. Basically, can you lay out again the arguments against? So Randall, I know that you've made your personal view on the ballot measure clear, but what are people saying who are, this issue does not seem to divide people neatly on partisan lines, necessarily on ideological lines, not even necessarily on racial lines or on gender lines. So what are people who are advocating against this measure saying?
Sure. I mean, there are people who have arguments against affirmative action, and these arguments have some weight. So one is, I mentioned earlier, the stigma argument, the claim that people who are assumed to be beneficiaries of affirmative action are somehow lacking. So let's suppose you go to a school, you get your degree, you go into a workplace, and the idea would be that people are not going to credit you as much. They're going to discount. You have the certificate, you've gone to such and such a place, you've got the certificate, but people are going to discount the certificate because they're going to say, well, there's affirmative action over there, and therefore the person got through, the person got the degree, but it's not worth as much. Is there something to that? Yeah, there's something to that, sure. And that's one of the reasons why I think, it's very important to design affirmative action in an intelligent way so you don't exacerbate, you don't accentuate the costs. Are there other costs? Yeah, I think there are other costs. So for instance, the mismatch theory. I agree with Patricia that I think it's been overblown, but are there situations in which are there situations in which people have been over promoted? I'm sure there are. Are there situations in which a student goes to a certain place, is really way too far over their head so that they get discouraged, they maybe drop out? I'm sure that happens. That is a cost. Another cost, to the extent in our country where racial division has been such a volatile force, if you're going to be using race to allocate prized positions, precious, scarce positions, if race is the way you're doing that, then in our country, where race has been such a third rail, there's going to be a lot of suspicion. There's going to be a lot of distrust. There's going to be a lot of resentment. Whether the resentment is fair or not, the fact that it exists is itself a cost. So does affirmative action have costs? Yes, affirmative action does have costs. I'm pro affirmative action, but does it have costs? Sure it does. In my view, the benefits of affirmative action outweigh the cost. But does it have costs? Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Patricia, can I ask you something?
I would just add that yes, there are costs on both sides. And I think the classic response is the race neutral response, that if we don't want to be discriminated against, we should not discriminate, and that giving any kind of a preference. And again, I'm very uncomfortable with the term preference, particularly the way we've used it in the university. I don't think we do much in terms of, even did before the ban, did much in terms of preference. But individuals will argue that if you don't want to have discrimination in society, then nobody should discriminate and we should all be colorblind. The reality is we're not colorblind, and our society doesn't operate as a colorblind society. And we are in fact very divided along racial and ethnic lines. And I guess I stand with the folks who would say we need to repair that. And the only way to repair it is to take race into account.
It's so interesting that you said, I always think about this with respect to Chief Justice John Roberts, where he says, the way to a colorblind society is essentially to stop taking race into account. And there have been some really vigorous arguments between Chief Justice John Roberts and, for instance, Justice Sonia Sotomayor on that. And if I hadn't already held you 14 minutes over, I would love to have those discussions. So for the people who are still watching, I do want to end with, again, what the proposition would do. And the proposition would say affirmative action is an option for public employment, for public contracting, and for public education. I know that we focus on public education. I know that a lot of the discussion is focused on public education. But as we did talk about throughout the panel, public employment obviously is a huge issue, considering what a big employee local governments and the state government is in California. There are hundreds of thousands of people that we're talking about who are employed by the state. Public contracting, again, a huge area where you can imagine that if affirmative action programs are permitted, this could change how local and the state governments award contracts if they want to take race or gender or ethnicity or national origin into account. And again, it's not just race. We're talking about race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin. I just got a real-time fact check that California, in fact, employs over 500,000 people. So we're talking about, again, those three buckets: contracts, employment, education. And we're not just talking about race, although understandably that dominated our conversation because that dominates the ballot measure. So with that, thank you both so much for sharing your expertise. We really could have gone on for, this could just be intermission as far as I'm concerned. Randall Kennedy, Patricia Gándara, I'm so grateful for your thoughts. And I know that the viewers are as well, and this will live online and it will help people make informed decisions. So with that, I'm not going to see you on the flip side. So I really do want to say, honestly, thank you. It's been a pleasure to spend an hour and a half with both of you, truly. And Hammer Forum, please play us off. Randall and Patricia, you can click leave meeting the moment you hear the music.
Okay, thank you for the invitation. And I look forward to Professor Kennedy and I being able to continue this at some point.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.